Hey everybody, welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host Valerie. So great to be here with you again today. And hi Nathan, hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
It will never not sound awkward when I say hi to you. It always feels so unnatural. Maybe I should say
hi first.
There you go.
Hi.
Hi, good to see you here. Look at you right there next to me. Okay, that was still awkward. We'll get there. All right, so today we have kind of a fun topic that I'm looking forward to talking to you about. And the reason why I want to talk to you about this is because I know that this is, some of you are going to come much later on down the road, and this will not necessarily be relevant to you for the reasons that I'm going to talk about it today, but nevertheless, we are talking about, in our small groups right now, we're spending a lot of time working on learning how to find comfort and safety within ourselves inside of the realm of close relationships while we're on a faith journey. So we used to be somebody, and we used to interact with all of these other people in our lives, a partner, our parents, our siblings, our friends. And then we have the audacity to expand and grow and change. And all of a sudden our worldviews are different. And we don't necessarily know how to be in connection with some of these people around us. And part of that might be because of how they are mapping our change, and they're insecure and unsure about how to relate to us. And part of it actually may also be because we too are insecure and not sure how to relate to them. Okay, so that is my little opening way to talk about how we might think about these relationships and think about what they might be struggling with as they learn how to relate to us. What I'm going to share with you today, Nathan and I are going to talk about, is a handful of various biases that we often have here in the Christian faith. Now, what I'm riffing off of is not Latter-day Saint specific. I'm taking this from Do I Stay Christian by Brian McLaren. And he talks a lot about how many Christian tradition churches oftentimes really struggle with constricted intellectualism, and they really train our brains to not know how to think complexly. And they also really do us a disservice in thinking about things from a more in a complex way. And so I want to set this up where I want you to think about somebody in your life that you love and care about, where you just seem like you're really struggling with feeling seen. And I want you to just think about these various biases that we tend to have in earlier stages of faith development. So this could be the person that you're thinking about that you struggle with. This could also be you and me. Okay, so it could be either of us, because I think we all, nobody like sits still. We're all very, life and humanity is very, very fluid. And so some days we may struggle with these biases ourselves. So, okay, so here's what Brian McLaren says. He says, to be a Christian, he began to feel was to practice a tightly constricted intellectualism, intellect in service of what we already believe. Okay, so sometimes think about, I'm going to just say, for example, if you have a partner or a parent who's very orthodox and really comfortable in their orthodoxy, and we're over here growing and challenging and changing and seeing things much more complexly, this is likely what they're struggling with through us. Okay, I'm going to just read through each one of these biases. Actually, I'm going to read a bias. That's not the right way to say it.
Bias.
A bias.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm just learning English. It is my first language, but it's not always very clear.
It's a singular and a plural.
Oh.
I have several biases.
Biases.
Bias is the singular.
Biases. Okay.
Yeah.
See, you guys, we're not even going to cut that out. You just get to listen to us trying to use our words properly. Okay, let's start with confirmation bias. Confirmation bias names our brain's tendency to reject anything that doesn't fit in with our current understanding, paradigm, belief system, or worldview. We all, I dare say, suffer from some confirmation bias.
Absolutely. Yeah, we accept the things that already conform to what we believe, and we reject the things that don't.
Okay, so
that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. So how might this come up a little bit in these faith, how do I say this? How do these come up in relationships where I'm believing something and you're believing something differently, and it's challenging our relationship?
Well, for me, the the place where I see confirmation bias the most, and I don't know if this is answering your question, but for me, the way I see confirmation bias the most is in our interpretation of Scripture. Scripture is all over the place. Let's be honest. And I can read a scripture. You can read the same scripture. We can read different scriptures from the New Testament, and we can totally find almost just about anything that will confirm my point and disprove your point. And you can find 10 scriptures that will prove your point and disprove my point. And it may be that we interpret them differently, or it may be that the scriptures hold a lot of contradictions and a lot of their points of view. And for me, that's a really classic one, behind all the different contentions within religion, between different religions. And so that's an easy one for me to point to. Now, within relationships, I mean, I think a lot of it is just sort of the same thing. Somebody could look at my children and say, gosh, your children, really didn't do X, Y, and Z very well. And I look at my children, I think they turned out pretty good. I've tried to give them freedom as I've learned how to be a better parent, like we talked about in our previous episode. So I look at it and say, I think my kids are psychologically healthy and they're doing lots of things. But somebody else could look at my kids and say, wow, that they don't fit the mold of a perfect Mormon. And so in their confirmation bias, my kids might be struggling, but in my bias, which I look at as I want my kids to be psychologically healthy, I think they look great.
So you're describing here that, say, for example, so it's the brain's tendency to reject anything that doesn't fit with our current understanding, paradigm, or belief system. So, for example, my 18 or 19-year-old son does not go on a mission. Therefore, he is doomed to a life of sadness and sorrow.
And he has let the Lord down.
And he's let the Lord down. That is
true blue bias.
That is a confirmation bias, which is my paradigm says for a child to be successful in the world, they need to do this, and this, right?
Yeah.
And we have our paradigms, and we have them in the form of checklists sometimes, is what we kind of like to talk about. Mm-hmm. And so basically what we're saying is that we have these things. Another one that's a big one that comes up a lot is there's a lot of confirmation bias around what does like eternal marriage. When you have couples that are really in struggle in the marriage because one partner is in faith expansion, another is in orthodoxy, the confirmation bias is there's only one way for this marriage to possibly survive. And it's if you come back my way and move back into our planned life together as Orthodox members of the church that stay, do all of the things that bring us to heaven together. Mm-hmm. And there's a bias there that rejects the possibility that there may be something else that bonds this couple together, even if it isn't those original ideas about temple equals eternal marriage equals eternal life together. We may not know what it is, but we know that there has to be a bigger way of looking at that.
Yeah.
Okay, but bias number 2 is complexity bias. That is our brain's tendency to prefer a simple lie to the complex truth. Okay, once again, this is not Latter-day Saints specific, but boy, this sure does apply to our church problems.
Sure. The
idea that I would prefer the narrative that was forwarded and has been, and in some ways is still, often forwarded. The simplicity of maybe what I like to call the work and the glory church history narrative, as opposed to looking at how the sausage is actually made and the complexities of a lot of our theology or of the development of our theology and the history itself. It's easier to just not want the complex because, it's easier to have the simplicity and it's harder to have the complexity.
Yeah, so. I can't tell you how many people, including people from our own families, have said to us, yeah, I think that there is a lot of things I still need to learn, but I'm just not in a place right now where I want to learn the church history, or I want to learn the doctrine behind the priesthood bands, or
whatever.
What I don't really want to know right now what went on with polygamy. I'm just trusting that the Lord was in charge. And it's like that's great that you have that, but it doesn't change the history. Um, and you and I once read that 80% of what people called anti-Mormon rhetoric is actually just our actual church history. And so people are just putting their heads in the sand when they don't want to know the church history because it's simpler to believe the Garden of Eden picture.
Well, and I find that super ironic because that sounds almost like a lazy learner over there. Right? But like going through the motion now or going through the process of dipping into complexity is there's no harder work out there for the soul, the mind, the body, the relationship.
Yeah.
It's hard work because it's complex. I think we are up to the task as children of divine parents. And yet at the same time, it's just really challenging work. And a lot of people make the conscious choice that they don't want to go there and do that.
Yep.
And I think it's at the detriment of their soul and of their relationships with themselves, with others, and with God. Although I think sometimes it feels like moving into complexity makes it worse and harder. It actually is harder, but at the end of the day, the growth is the thing that at least I'm looking for, I'm interested in. And so if we're interested in growth, we have to be able to push into and embrace the complexity.
Mm-hmm.
But the bias is to not want to do that. The bias is to just stay away from that like crazy. Okay, the next one is community bias. Our brain's tendency to reject any idea that will endanger our status in communities we belong to choose tribe over truth. Woo! Once again, this could be written especially for our people.
Yeah, but we all, I mean, it's a human problem.
Yep.
I mean, the church may have a special place in that problem, but I mean, we do it with our country, we do it with our social groups as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, once you join a group, whether it's the Boy Scouts or the military or a religious organization, you tend to develop a loyalty within that group. And that's not a bad thing. Loyalty is a good quality. And we all know stories of soldiers who have died for freedom or who have gone back and rescued a comrade. And so loyalty has its place. But if loyalty trumps truth and honesty, when you start, in an organization and you're lying for each other, or you're covering each other, then it's when it becomes a problem. Community can't trump our own integrity.
Right. And what you're describing about that whole how community, the desire to fit in is a human problem is absolutely correct. It's absolutely like evolutionary truth. If we don't have a community around us from an evolutionary standpoint, we get eaten by the bears and the tigers. And so we need them around us. And the most profound and painful way of punishing someone is to let them be alone. Right? Solitary confinement is considered the greatest of punishment.
Yeah.
And so we want to fit into community to keep us safe. And so what happens though is sometimes, and this is again what happens to a lot of us in faith expansion, is it feels in some cases like we are choosing between community and integrity. And that's why my deepest desire is we grow collectively as a community so that people don't have to feel like they have to make a choice, that they can grow in their integrity with a community around them that is buoying them up and cheering them on.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're strong enough so that even if they have to confront people that don't have that kind of bandwidth or maturity, that they have a community around them elsewhere that can give them the strength to live in their integrity and to seek truth over loyalty to tribe.
Yes.
Okay, going on. Next is the comfort and complacency bias. Our brain's tendency to reject information that makes us uncomfortable, is inconvenient, or disrupts our complacency.
Mm-hmm.
Woo.
Yeah, so that's not necessarily very different than some of the other ones we've talked about, but for me, I'll go back to an experience that I remember having back in the early 2000s in some of the presidential campaigns. Environmental issues were a big topic, and the Democrat party tends to err on the side of, hey, I think the environment is, falling apart, and the Republicans or the more conservative parties tend to feel like it's all made up, it's a big story, and the Democrats are just alarmists. And I was very conservative, and I was in that party of, the environment's fine, we're doing just fine, and it's just a bunch of lies. Until I started doing my own kind of reading and my own research and my own thinking, and I thought, no, actually, we are doing a lot of things that are damaging to our planet and to our environment. And there really is a buildup of carbon in the atmosphere. And so it would have been much more convenient to believe that that wasn't happening. But it is happening, and it is an actual fact. And just because we built our society around automobiles that run on gasoline doesn't mean it's not true.
Right.
So it would be really easy, it'd be really convenient to say it's a lie and we can keep burning our fossil fuel generating cars without consequence. But the harder answer is, no, we are damaging our environment. There is too much carbon in the atmosphere, and we've built our society on carbon fuel cars, fossil fuel cars, and that's a problem.
Wow.
And it's a big problem because it's how we've built ourselves, and it's going to require an entire change of paradigm, but it doesn't make it false. It doesn't make it not true.
You just perfectly described what some would consider the biggest harm in constricted intellectualism, which is, if you had never done that research, you could have stayed deeply committed to your false paradigm, which would have kept you comfortable.
Right.
And we can absolutely, I don't know that we have time today to do it, but you could take Nathan's story and transpose that kind of story over into anything that is spiritual in nature, and talk about the same concepts. Right. We can constrict intellectualism, constrict research, constrict looking at psychology or science, because what we may find there might be incredibly uncomfortable.
And people will say things in their own minds like, well, it can't be true because it would be too hard if it were true. Like, we would have to change everything that we've done in the realm of energy and transportation if what you're saying is actually true. And so then somehow they're like, well, okay, because of that, it can't be true. And it's like, no, it is true, and it is a problem. And
we may need to change everything, in fact.
We are going to have to go to electric cars. Let's just be honest. I mean, that has to happen at some point. And like you said, that principle applies to all kinds of spiritual things, but there are things that we're going to look at, at some point in the church and say, yeah, we've been doing it wrong.
Well, I think I can't help but just can't resist the lowest hanging fruit here is LGBT.
Yeah.
That there are those who want to say it can't be true, because if it is true that science has caught up and we've been wrong all along, it would require us to change everything.
We have to change so many things, and that would just be too hard. So it can't be true. So just ignore it.
And I really feel like that is where we are deeply struggling, but it's the very same kind of thing. Do we have to maybe perhaps change everything in certain theological understandings to catch up with what we have come to know through science, even though it's very uncomfortable and it's really going to challenge the complacency of many people? The answer is yes. Okay, let's move on to the next one. The confidence bias. Our brain's tendency to believe people who display confidence, rendering us susceptible to those who come on strong even when they're wrong, including authoritarians and con artists. The confidence bias.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a great example of that in our church history. Brigham Young was a great leader. Okay. No one questions his leadership ability or his courage to lead the members of the church out of Illinois, where it had become too dangerous to stay, and into a part of the country that was uninhabited, or, certainly no one had ever cultivated or civilized the Mountain West. And he was a great pioneer that way, and people trusted him and they trusted his vision. And so when he comes out in 1852 and says that dark skin is the curse of Cain, and according to God, dark-skinned people cannot go to the temple or hold the priesthood and never will. And if they, intermarry with white people, that they should be put to death. The church just took him at his word.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say, Nathan, is you said that Brigham Young was a great leader. I want to challenge that a little bit and just say, I think maybe what I'm thinking, and maybe you can totally disagree, but he had great leadership skills in colonizing.
That's exactly what I meant.
Okay.
That
Yes.
as a man who could organize people, get them together,
Okay.
colonize. We got to get water out here. We got to spread a little bit. He was a very good organizational manager.
Okay, thank you for that, because I was like, calling him a great leader, because it pains me, because I used to just have that very, speaking of all these previous biases we were talking about, it was more comfortable for me to believe that all of the prophets of the church were all of the things I wish they were. And yet the more we learn, the more we come to know, the more we recognize that many of them were not in fact great leaders, from a perspective of leading people towards truth and God.
Right. But because of his great leadership skills, and because he did have a vision of what it could become, people just sort of fell in line with a lot of things that he said that in retrospect were just kind of outright crazy.
Right. Very, very harmful, actually.
Harmful,
not neutral.
Harmful and biased by the views of the day and so forth. And whereas people should have been able to say, and we wish people could have said, hey, you are this great leader and you have brought us to this valley where we can be safe. And yet I also disagree with what you just said. And so that to me is where the challenge is.
Yes. And they were less than a generation away. I mean, because he had followed the prophet Joseph Smith, there was such a strong emphasis on allowing the chosen leader to basically have such a strong voice that it muted the psychological, spiritual agency and development of the followers. Mm-hmm. Because he also really expanded polygamy 100-fold,
right,
above and beyond what Joseph had done, which already was wrong, of course. If any of you are very interested in learning every detail of transfer of power from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young and all of the things that happened in that period, it will blow your mind with fascination. I would invite you to go to D. Michael Quinn's book called The Origins of Power and read all about, talk about masterful shenanigans. Brigham Young is the king of masterful shenanigans in getting himself made to be the prophet. It'll blow your mind. Okay, anyhow, confidence bias is right. He's a great example. So thank you for that, Nathan. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Conspiracy bias is our brain's tendency to believe stories that exonerate us or portray us as innocent victims or unsung heroes while vilifying an outgroup or individual, either real or concocted. Conspiracy bias.
Yeah. So we're pretty good at this too.
Aren't we though?
All people who have suffered at the hands of another group or individual have a tendency to take on this sort of victim or martyr complex. And when we do that, it is often in an effort to try to give ourselves more power in a situation, power that we wouldn't normally have. I am a victim, therefore I have a higher moral, I start on a higher moral ground than you, therefore what I say must be morally right. And the struggle there is that we honor victims and we honor people who have been tragically hurt. And yet, even still, having been a victim doesn't make you more correct on some of your points of view.
Right. And as actually, perfect example, speaking of, you got me in the 1840s and 50s with Brigham Young on my mind. And I'm thinking about how you could really argue that there is some legitimate victim stories that accompany the very, very beginning of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Right? And yet at the same time, what we ended up doing in moving west and colonizing Utah is we actually became the perpetrators and victimized the Native Americans.
Absolutely.
And so here we are, we have put what we did. I'm just going to go back, flipping pages here. The tendency to believe story that exonerate us or portray us as innocent victims or unsung heroes, and not having the eyes to see that we too are creating victims in the same larger story. It's very seldom that we ever hear about how we ran out several tribes of Native Americans in our colonization efforts. And this is, once again, it's a Mormon problem, but it's also a Christian problem, and it's a Western problem.
Yeah.
It's something that we have done. The manifest destiny idea really sets up this beautiful picture of heroes moving through the world and doing these beautiful things. And it's like, but the carnage we caused
Right.
in this narrative and the deep and profound commitment to the unawareness, in this case of Native American peoples throughout the history of the developing nations. I mean, it's just almost not even present.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think Native Americans is a perfect example of that. You know, the Protestants came over because they had been persecuted in Europe, and then somehow they thought, well, we're going to make the Native Americans better than they were. They're pagans, and we've got to make them Christians. And it's like, well, are they better off? Have we made them better?
Yeah.
You know, because I think you could make a strong case that they are not better off for having met us, the, heterosexual cisgender white males of the world.
Right, all the patriarchy.
I don't think we've made them better.
Well, and it says here, and then we vilify the out group. I mean, they were, what do they call? I mean, they were called the savages or something.
Savages, pagans, you know.
Right,
and that doesn't mean they weren't without savagery. I mean, they were brutal to each other, but did we make them better? That's the whole thing. It's like, yeah, it's like, the bias is this. It's very easy to say, because I was the victim, then what I've done is okay. And you can't take that at face value. You have to go back and look at the individual actions on a case-by-case basis.
Well, and I think it's really important to recognize that there is a pattern at play that happens over and over again, which is oftentimes the victim somehow becomes more powerful only to become the victimizer of a new underdog.
Right.
And on and on and on it goes. And so to really make sure that we are not suffering from this bias in our own blindness. Okay, let's go on. We just have a couple more. This one is called the catastrophe normalcy bias. Our brain's tendency to respond to dramatic catastrophes, but easily miss compounding slow erosions of normalcy.
Yeah. So little tiny changes over time, creating situations that we ignore. That's a good one. Yeah. That's not one that I've actually given a whole lot of thought to be perfectly honest, but I can see where he's coming from. It's easy, like for instance, with 9/11, when, they fly planes into our skyscrapers and kill 2,000 Americans, and really, what was basically an unprovoked act of violence. It's easy for us to get together and say, okay, we've got to defend ourselves. We've got to get out here and cut off terrorism, which, again, not everybody may agree with that point of view, but the nation got united behind a message after that. But we have, as a country, for sure, perpetrated all kinds of little microaggressions all over the world. I was actually just talking to my daughter, who wrote a paper about our involvement in a democratic election in Central America, in Guatemala, where the Guatemalans had a democratic election, elected a guy that we didn't like, and we ran him out and sent Guatemala into like a 45-year civil war that it's never recovered from economically. And so, that's not something we hear about. That's not a sin of our country that we ever talk about, because there are these little tiny things under the surface. That's an interesting one.
So tell me help me connect what you're saying here. So you were talking about 9/11, which I get.
Well, the catastrophe bias is that when something massive happens, it's very easy for us to see what went wrong and what might be the response, and for us to get united. But the idea that when there's just little things under the surface, it's really easy to ignore.
Right.
We just kind of ignore them.
So yes, I get that, but I'm trying to connect Guatemala to that.
Well, I'm just saying that we are, as a country, I'm using the United States and our military might
Okay.
as an example, is that we have gone out and very quietly performed little
Oh.
acts of aggression across the world, but because they weren't catastrophes, because they weren't
Well,
big things that made the news, people have just kind of learned to ignore it. Say, okay, yeah, we conquered this people, and we conquered Samoa, and we've done this, but it was never a big catastrophe
well, it wasn't big
thing.
for us. It was awfully big for them.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah.
But where we are as a people, it didn't make a lot of headlines, and so there wasn't a lot of uprising or uproar from our people over those kinds of little things.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, let's move on to the next one, the last one here, and this is called the cash bias. Our brain's tendency to accept information that might interfere with our way of making a living. Okay.
Well, nobody wants their way of living interfered with.
Yeah. So there is this tendency that we have to shut down possibilities of our own expanding mind when it interferes with our capacity to provide for the people that we love.
Yeah. So Richard Rohr and Brian McLaren both have talked about a really interesting version of that, which is what happens when a priest or a pastor is making a living by teaching the people religious principles, and they themselves come to a point where they no longer believe or think they come across things that aren't consistent with their integrity, and now they have to decide, well, what do I do? And I think this happens in our church with like CES employees.
Yep.
So I make a living by teaching seminary in Utah, but I don't necessarily know if I agree with some of our stances on a few things, but I'm going to just ignore that, because if it's true, I got to change careers.
It's very painful, inconvenient. It may hurt my children.
Yeah.
If I have to go find another career somewhere else. And we know and love people firsthand who have had to do that. But I think the bias here is that there are many people that will willfully choose not to grow and learn and have these complex relationships with truth, because that just feels like it's too hard, and it may potentially hurt too many people if it has to do with our capacity to earn a living.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I want to just throw out two final quotes before we close up our time today. Brian McLaren says this: "I wish that my religion had helped me and others face and confront these biases instead of reinforcing them with religious devotion. I wish that we Christians had taken seriously our founders' words about the truth setting us free, the full and actual truth, that is, not half-truths and not groupthink. I wish we had learned that the word repent means rethink, which means questioning our biases and challenging unquestioned assumptions. I wish that my religion had taught me to challenge bias by thinking critically, to be curious rather than afraid of the truth, to follow the truth wherever it might lead and whomever it might come through. But instead, I'm sad to say, my religious community held me within a great wall of bias, with a constricted intellectualism that was actually worse than mere anti-intellectualism. Anti-intellectualism is lazy and easily defeated. Constricted intellectualism is always on duty, always vigilant, and always at war." And then one last thing that he talks about regarding biases that I just think is beautiful. All right, so he's talking about how, I just love Brian McLaren because, once again, he is a former pastor, and he is just so brutally honest with what Christianity can do to help itself become stronger and healthier. He says there is a lot of money to be made and power to be gained by short-sighted leaders, political or religious, who use the confidence bias to tell people the comforting lies and simple untruths they want to hear, rather than the complex and uncomfortable truths that they need to hear. Community and confidence bias will reinforce the fantasies preached by their leaders. Complacency bias will prompt them to unplug the smoke alarms rather than put out fires. Conspiracy bias will divert their attention from real dangers to imaginary ones, and it will keep them fighting one another rather than uniting against their common danger and for the common good. and catastrophe normalcy bias will keep people oblivious to the slowly deteriorating conditions until it is too late. And perhaps cash bias will be the thing that pulls the nuclear and climate triggers in the end. So I will link this book in the bio today, or not in the show notes, so that you can take a peek at this book. Nathan and I are actually in preparation of doing an entire analysis of Do I Stay Christian, which has 10 points why not to stay Christian and 10 points why to stay Christian. And so if you have not read that book yet, it's a wonderful book. And if you haven't read it and don't plan to, you can listen to our future episode down the road where we package this nicely up and give you a little bit of a book review. So any final thoughts, Nathan?
No, good discussion.
Okay, so good to be with you all today. It's great to have so many of you knowing you close and personal in these weekly processing and support groups. If you're interested in getting on a wait list for one of those, catch me at Valerie Hamaker. Catch me at info@valeriehamaker.com or on Instagram at Latter-day Struggles Podcast. If you want individual long-term coaching with one of my colleagues, catch me at that same address. Or if you want time limited, a few quick consults with me, I'll do 2 or 3 with any individual or couple, time permitting, at info@valeriehamaker.com. Please rate and review this podcast. It's ever so helpful to have your kind ratings and reviews helping people understand the nature of the work that Nathan and I are so committed to doing with you and on your behalf. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.